Hi everybody and welcome to Adapt or Die, the truth about climate change, lightning talks brought to you by the library at Griffith University. This is the third year of lightning talks where researchers from the university share their discoveries and their passions. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Yugambeh and Comberry people. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We live in strange times. 2/3 of our state is in drought, and in Sydney, dam levels are now so low that the city's desalination plant might be fired up in the next little while. Yet we have a new Prime Minister who famously brought a lump of coal into Parliament as a prop for his speeches and is seriously considering withdrawing Australia from the Paris Agreement. We're here today because we believe that evidence and expertise are the ways to solve the wicked problems that we're faced with, and climate change is one of those issues. Griffith was the first university in the country to put a prime focus on environmental science with the establishment of the School of Australian Environmental Studies in 1977. That mission continues today with the university's focus on tackling the grand challenge of climate change, and that's what our speakers will be talking to us about today. Our speakers will be talking for about 8 to 10 minutes. There will be some time for questions in between the talks, but we will save more time for questions at the end. We're encouraging you to tweet using the hashtags Adapt or Die, Lightning Talks and Griffith Library. And this event is being live streamed on Facebook Live and video recorded so that people who can't be here today will be able to share the views of our speakers. So it gives me great pleasure first up to introduce Professor Cordia Chu. Cordia is the Director of the Centre for Environment and Population Health, and she's interested in topics such as global health security, climate change, adaptation and health. The topic that she's provided for her talk talks about how we're slow to adapt and short on actionable solutions, and that what we need now is not the why but the how of climate change adaptation. How do we get all the different parties to work together, from citizens to government to researchers and everyone else that needs to be part of that picture. So please put your hands together for Cordia.
Thank you. Hello. I have the pleasure of starting this conversation, but, well, adapt or die, what a gloomy topic. And I think the sky just changed for us to set the scene. So let me just go back to, sorry, I just go a bit too fast. And that also set the scene too. And I like to focus on the how question of climate change adaptation. And I want to make several points first. First, I like to say there are mounting evidence about climate change impacts, yet we're slow to adapt. We urgently need not why question, not how big the problem is anymore, but how question of climate change adaptation. Scientists and researchers need to start to work more with stakeholders to find solutions. And in fact, good examples we started to emerge, but much, much more are needed urgently. And the entire society must grasp a partnership approach. The key is partnership approach to find usable solutions and act on them. But how can we overcome the immense challenges ahead? And that's the point in a very short time I want to express, mostly using image. Mounting evidence about climate change impacts threatening our health and our future. Most people want to know, is that really changing? We just change. Today's change means global warming. I see someplace else having more ice. This is the actual temperature that's recorded. And this is for, in case people say this may be fake news, but this is actually true recordings. So, second picture I want to show is this really alarming color. And you can see from here to there, if here, many species will be doomed. And if we don't do any mitigation, 6.4 degrees, it is going to be very, very difficult to reverse or live on. Is it serious? Yes. Expect that future heat wave and heavy precipitation events will become more frequent and intense and more different pattern of this disease. And as you can say, they're still moving, changing all the time. More sandstorm, forest fire, food security, more people go hungry. And look at all this pattern of changes that we're facing. Economic losses too, of course. And heat wave, and some places are extreme and they're cold. And what hit us, the world started to pay attention, was a tsunami, if you like. The disasters. You can see every time we have number of deaths, and then we talk about Katrina, the whole world was watching. And what is really alarming is that healthcare facility and emergency services being stretched to the limit. So to sum up the impact, global warming, extreme climatic event, people lost their home, been displaced, infectious disease and floods and so on. And this is no wonder Lancet say climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And we know that we need to mitigate, and we also know we need to adapt. However, we do a lot more on the mitigation, like saving the consumption and so on. But adaptation is still, why are we so low to adapt? Am I really talking about adaptation low? Means that we have to make the adjustment to minimize harm. Let's look at our leading healthcare people with a lot of smart people, but not climate smart. A lot of latest technology. We do know that climate change will amplify disasters, increase health risks. But in disaster, in a changing world, health infrastructure are ill-prepared. Well, this is Penang. Flood, cyclone, what happened? 7 hospitals paralyzed. And what happened in Puerto Rico? And IV bags, not enough. And what about good old Australia? There are rich heat wave, power shortage in Melbourne. This is just last year. And there are plenty more examples that we will show you. But this one, it really gut-wrenching. This is the rich Houston, and elderly were sitting on the puddle of water, and they were waiting in their elderly home. We gotta do better. So, we know enough about impacts now. It's not the why question, but how question of climate change adaptation we need urgently. And that's what we are very short. Scientists and researchers, because this is university's atmosphere, I'd like to start with them. They need to conduct what we call the translational research and engage stakeholders to come up with actionable solutions. So what does that mean by translational? First, it needs to be useful, and most we can find the gaps, so we can find it useful. We can probably point to solving solutions and improving the current practices. But many of them cannot withstand the so what question. Is that understandable? Is that user-friendly? Are we ready to be used? And then finally, would people use it? And so would they implement? Would they buy in? Would they assist in their decision making? So these are the big questions, and that's actually useful, usable, and use. And that means it's the key essence about translational research. Okay, so in climate change, this is particularly important. We know how big the problem is. The question is that what are we going to do about it? And then what the translational research means, well, we have a lot of actually good example we can see. Now go back to the health sector, which is where I come from. Green and healthy hospitals are leading the way to future-proof themselves against climate change and disaster risks. So green and healthy hospital, we have more than 30,000 of them now and the member. And then we can talk about healthy planet, healthy hospital, and energy efficiency, all this good practice from Green Hospital and pictures is good evidence of proving. And they're working. And they're good, looking that they have both mitigation and adaptation. So they can lead the way in future-proofing ourselves against climate change, climate risk, and also about for the future of the health system as well. Now, community also adapt. You can see this is Humboldt in Vietnamese village. Harvest earlier, put their livelihood, an important thing up there. The food industry has changed. Food, there really a lot of exciting things are starting to happening. And what about the urban system? That's changing too. And I think that is good news. But they're emerging only. Much more translation research are needed urgently for climate change adaptation. It's not as easy as we thought. We're talking about useful, usable, useful and usable and use. So now that's the problem that I want to give you an example of dengue. We need early warning system. But that's what we basically do. We give people this kind of formula. So what are we supposed to do about it? So you need to make it much usable so that people can actually use it and for prevention. But just you have usable tool, would that mean the stakeholder would want to use it? Who are the stakeholder? And will they agree? So then we need to have stakeholder engagement. And that's not easy. Everybody have different perspective, different interests. How to facilitate that how is also important now. So, and then we need to really co-produce management tool to then the community will adopt, I hope. And then we need some kind of activating community activation too. So, almost finished now. Adaptation really is about shared responsibility. Factoring climate risk into decision making. An evidence-based risk management approach, helping the vulnerable, collaborative, value-based approach, revisiting decision and overcome, and then you can look at this one, National Climate Resilient Adaptation Strategy, and that was from there. Queensland too. Finally, we have an adaptation called Pathway to a Climate Resilient Queensland. On the 11th, they're going to launch the health adaptation. It's all about partnership. So, it's all about global partnership. And we want a future. The entire society must grasp a partnership approach to find useful, usable solutions and act on them. But that's the challenge. So, how can we overcome them to secure a sustainable future? I'm asking you another how question. How? Before we run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cordia. We've got time for one or two quick questions, and there'll be time at the end as well. Chris is passing around the speaker's box if anyone has a question. Okay, we'll move along and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Thanks, Cordia, for that thought-provoking kind of introduction. Our next speaker is Dr. Wade Hadwen. Wade's a lecturer in the School of Environment and Science here at Griffith and a researcher in the Australian Rivers Institute and the Griffith Climate Change Response Group. He's all about water. By training, he's an aquatic ecologist, but his research focuses on how human and ecological systems interact. And the common thread throughout all of his research is water, how it's used, valued, impacted, and managed. Thanks, Wade.
Thank you very much. I knew as an aquatic ecologist and someone very interested in water that I would make it rain today because I'm going to talk about water scarcity. And water scarcity to me is something that we really have to focus on in the coming years. Climate change requires us to think more about this than we currently do, and already there's major problems with water scarcity. I also believe that we need to focus on water generally in our dialogue very broadly. We focus a lot on carbon with our mitigation approaches and so on, but we are all water people because 60% of our bodies is water. There's very little fresh water on the planet, even though we are all on the blue planet. Most of the water on the planet, of course, is salt water that is not readily a usable resource for humans. So we need to think about fresh water, where it is, and how people are using it. Of the total resource of water on the planet, less than 1% is fresh water in a liquid state that we can readily use for humans. Of that less than 1%, we tend to use about 80% of that on irrigated agriculture, about almost 20% on industry, and less than 1% of that less than 1% is water that we drink. So we're talking about a tiny fraction of water on the planet that's really important to all of us to sustain our lives. In terms of water scarcity, I think it's important to reflect on the global situation. So currently, this is without any forecasting in terms of climate change impacts, 4 in every 10 people on the planet have currently experienced water scarcity problem. So they don't have enough water to meet their demand. 4 in every 10. What that means in real terms is that there are 780 million people on the planet that don't have access to safe drinking water. That's a huge number of people that don't have the resource that we rely on when we turn on our taps. We're very lucky in Australia that we have that resource on tap. The consequence of so many people not having access to safe drinking water, and when I talk about safe, it's not just how much water they've got, but it's whether or not it's of a quality that people can actually consume and not get sick. And the reality for many people around the world is that the water they drink makes them sick. So of that 780 million people without adequate access to drinking water, every year we see 2.2 million people die from water-related disease. And typically that's diarrheal-related diseases that are highly preventable if we treat water and if we provide enough water to people. That's the current situation. So let's think about what climate change will do to the water cycle. Water is the system that will be really intensely affected by climate change. We know that things are going to change and make life much more difficult for people. If we think about water scarcity, the projection by 2025 is that 1.8 billion people on the planet will be experiencing water scarcity. 2025 is 7 years away. 1.8 billion people experiencing water scarcity. If we think about what that means in terms of communities and livelihoods, the projection by 2030 is that between 24 and 700 million people will be displaced because of water scarcity problems. That means they cannot continue to live in the place that they currently live. They can't continue to do what they currently do. If we think about transformation of landscapes, sub-Saharan Africa by 2080, we expect to lose somewhere between 30 and 60 million hectares of agricultural land. And that will be caused by desertification, so transferring agricultural land into a large desert. That obviously has huge implications for humans as well in terms of the food security part of the story. So I hope that snapshot at the global scale will help you understand why we need to talk about water more and think about how we can adapt to water scarcity more broadly. Of course, today we're doing all right now that it's raining, but large parts of Australia, as you know, are currently drought affected. Now what I want to do today is talk through a couple of different case studies to show how water scarcity and aspects of water scarcity influence people all around the planet. This photo is a photo from one of the field sites that we've been doing some work in the Solomon Islands. This is a village that has too much water most of the time. The Solomon Islands is a very rain-affected place. Flooding is a major problem. Although there's plenty of water, this community still suffers from water scarcity because much of the water in their environment is not safe to drink. So they have to try and manage their activities on a daily scale to match what water is available and whether that water is safe for that purpose. So the work we've done in this community shows that this community has 5 different sources of water that it uses every day. So it's got rainwater, river water, water from springs, well water, and on occasions bottled water that they buy. And they use those different sources of water for different purposes based on the quality, based on their perception of quality. They don't run around with meters understanding the qualities as we do as scientists, but they've got perceptions around what sources are safe to drink and which ones are not. And this community prioritises rainwater as a really important water source that they will drink. They consider that to be a very safe source. If they drink from the river, they will get diarrhoea and get very sick. So already this community shows great resilience to adapt to changes in water resources. During the flooding season, they changed their pattern of behaviour to adapt to the conditions. This is a really important learning, I think, for us in the developed world, because we don't really do this. We don't use multiple sources of water routinely and map our use against the quality and the availability of that source. Which brings us to a developed context. This photo is from Cape Town. You may have heard earlier in the year that Cape Town was threatened with what people have been calling Day Zero, and that's the day effectively where the taps get turned off. That community, that city, will run out of water. That was projected to occur back in March. Fortunately, some farmers sold back some irrigation water and delivered it back into the reservoir to push that Day Zero back, and there has been some storms recently. So the current projection is Day Zero will be next year now. It doesn't mean the problem's been solved, it just means that we're putting off this critical point in Cape Town's future. This photo shows Cape Town residents in February this year lining up to get their ration of tap water. So tap water, the pipe network is there, the infrastructure's there, the resource is just not there in this climate vulnerable part of the world. The challenge is, should we be relying on a single source of water like we do in Cape Town, like we do in many parts of Australia? Here we're focused on using river water, capturing it in reservoirs and using that source of water as our sole source. If there's variability in rainfall, we're highly vulnerable. We're not resilient. So that's the story of Cape Town, and that's one that was echoed during the Millennium Drought through many cities in Australia as well, where we started to run very low in our reservoir capacity, and we started to look at other ways that we might be able to adapt and build some resilience in our water network. Which brings us to the Australian context. So this is an aerial photo of a farmer standing in the middle of his farm dam. This is from Gunnedah. This is just in the past week. It's clearly a very affected landscape currently. As you know, large parts of Queensland are drought declared, and 100% of New South Wales is drought declared. This has raised some very interesting questions and some debate in federal parliament recently. There is water in the reservoirs, but the water has been allocated and bought for the environment. So there's currently 1,200 gigalitres of water, so that's a gigalitre is 1 billion litres of water that's secured and saved for the environment, and now farmers want to get access to that water. And it creates a huge amount of conflict between water for people and water for the environment. If we give that water to the people, the environment will suffer. The whole river system could die if we don't deliver environmental water to that system. Lots of questions and lots of discussions needed around how we manage water when we've got it, when everyone wants it, when the demand is really high. Of course, we do have some adaptation strategies. This is the desalination plant at Tugun, down by the Gold Coast Airport. This is a part of our solution to the Millennium Drought, is to put online these kind of large infrastructure solutions, turning seawater into fresh water. It comes at a cost though. It comes at an energetic cost. These plants are very energetically hungry. It comes at an economic cost as well. The desal plant in Sydney at the moment costs $175 million a year to hold on standby. When they turn it on, it will cost $240 million a year to deliver drinking water to people in Sydney, which equates to about $130 per household in Sydney. So there's an economic cost, and there's also an environmental cost with some of these solutions in terms of what do we do with the waste that's generated, the brine that comes out of this system, where does it go? So we can turn salt water into fresh water. Some of the most recent innovation, though, has been focusing on water vapour, so what we're seeing a lot of today being converted into rain. The estimates suggest that there's as much water in our atmosphere as water vapour as there is in our rivers and lakes and groundwater reserves. So there's a lot of water in the air that we're walking around in. There's been a huge investment in technology to look at stripping water out of the air and delivering it to people as drinking water. Everything from large-scale, energy-heavy procedures like this in the UAE to some smaller systems that you can generate a couple of litres of your own drinking water with a little device that you carry around with you that just uses solar energy and heat from the sun to strip out the water vapour and turn it into liquid water. So there are some great technological solutions out there. The real challenge for us is to try and manage the technology, try to manage our behaviour as well. Thinking about where people need to live, where people need to be a bit more sensible with the water resources that they've got available to them. And ultimately, adaptation will need to involve a whole range of processes like migration, really detailed management and those trade-offs, and lots of technology will come into play as well. But it won't come without cost or pain. The real challenge, as I stated at the beginning, was we need to address water scarcity now, and it's only going to get worse with climate change. And with that, I'll leave it. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome our third speaker, Professor Catherine Pickering. She's been down on the plant stall earlier today at the Sustainability Fair. Catherine is the discipline head for Ecology and Evolution in the School of Environment and Science. She's a botanist, an ecologist and an environmental scientist. And a couple of interesting things. She's produced the Grow Native gardening app, which is just fantastic. Such a great resource. And she's been working with gardeners, turning the Gold Coast camp native plants. So she'll be talking to us about how planting natives in our gardens and cities can help deal with climate change. Please welcome Catherine.
Hello and welcome to today. And as Wade has talked about, one of the things that's really important is water. And as Claudia has talked about, is this really important issues about how our cities and our livelihood globally and locally are going to be affected by climate change. So I'm a botanist as part of the work I do. And what I want to talk about is how we can do something using plants to help offset some of the impacts of climate change. Because one of the things we're really aware of is it's incredibly important for us to have research that demonstrates what the impacts are going to be of climate change, and it's really important for us to have information about the threats and the challenges, but it's also really important sometimes to have practical things that we can do as an individual, because otherwise we can come along and end up going away feeling so disheartened but also so unempowered. And you know, Wade has highlighted in terms of water some of those critical issues about that. And there's things about conserving water, being conscious about the water we can do, being conscious about other effects. What I want to do is say, how can we use plants? And we're going to start with a little bit about plants, because we're talking to you today in southeast Queensland and on the Gold Coast. And one of the things that's really important is to understand just how phenomenally beautiful and diverse are the plants in this area. And this becomes important because both in terms of what will change, but also what we can do to deal with climate change. So in the area, we've got 145 different ecosystems, over 3,200 different plants. On the Gold Coast alone, we've got 1,670 native plants. Just to give you a perspective on that, the United Kingdom has 1,700 native plants. So we're doing really well on the Gold Coast. And as you can see here, they occur in a whole range of climates, a whole range of environments, from the very hot, dry dunes, through the wetlands, through forests and into the rainforests. And this is really important because it shows that plants from our area are adapted to a whole range of environments. And on the Gold Coast, we plant lots of plants and we have lots of lush gardens. This is also really important because when we think of native plants, we often think of the ones from the temperate region. We're adapted to much drier conditions, whereas we've got lots of lush, beautiful gardens. And what we're doing at Griffith and supporting the community is to grow native plants. And this includes things like planting out the campus with over 250 different species of native plants, predominantly from southeast Queensland. So please come and check out the gardens. They are absolutely stunning. And they're planted to try and minimise their needs for any additional support, including, of course, water being an issue. So if you grow local plants, they're already adapted to the climate and they're adapted to the soil. So they require less energy to be able to maintain. And that's really important as we're talking about sustainability, because they'll require less water, but they'll also require less nutrients and other things being brought into the system, which again is part of that impacts of climate change, the food miles, where you can think of plant miles. They provide habitat for wildlife, and as the climate change, we need more and more areas that provide support and resources for our wildlife. They conserve the local plants, obviously if you're planting natives. They add value to our properties, and I'm going to come to how to choose the best street trees in a moment. But let me tell you that there's a study done in Sydney that found that the increase in the average value of a house in a street that has trees compared to the equivalent street without was $60,000. So that street tree can save you a lot of money, $60,000 from just per house, just by putting trees into your streets, not streets into your trees. They're also really important because they don't become weeds, and this is really critical because as we disturb the environment, one of the things we're doing when we're changing the environment is we're increasing the spread of weeds globally, and climate change is going to add to that problem by favouring a whole lot of new species. And also a sense of place. If we're on the Gold Coast in southeast Queensland, it's really nice to look around and see plants that are from the area. Classically, you can go to a lot of resorts on the Gold Coast, plantings, and you'll see plants that are the same as resorts anywhere in the world. Hey, let's make them about here. And finally, they're beautiful. So these are just some of the plants growing from our campus, and one of them is the largest terrestrial orchid in Australia, and that is flowering just over here by the entrance to the library. And it's an endangered species from our local swamps, something that will be impacted by climate change. So, climate change, what's going to happen on the Gold Coast? Well, it's going to get hotter, and we had a really hot winter. It's going to get drier mostly, and we've just finished a really strong dry period. Since April, we've had very little rain. Over the weekend to today, that's changed, which is really good. But one of the effects is we're going to have more extreme, when the rain comes, it's going to come more intensely. So we're going to get more rainfall and flooding. And another thing we're going to get on the Gold Coast, which is a really big impact for climate change, is coastal erosion and flooding. We're going to get more cyclones, more east coast lows, more torrential rain. So these are really big impacts that affect us in this city. And one of the things is we can actually use plants to help minimise those impacts, to adapt to climate change. So with extreme heat, in fact, heat waves kill more people in Australia than bushfires and cyclones combined. It's a massive problem. Thousands of people die with heat waves. And it's the minimum temperatures at night and the heating up of our cities over a period. Cities are already several degrees warmer than the surrounding areas. Then you add in these extreme heat effects, it's a massive issue, and it kills vulnerable people. Children and elderly people are particularly susceptible to these extreme heat. How can you minimise it? Plant trees in our cities. Directly, the amount of trees we have is a way of minimising that heating. In our garden, if we plant trees, we can shade our houses, we can minimise the heating up of the bricks, the paving, the cements, the roads, which all adds to this urban heat island effect that makes cities hotter. They have a dramatic effect in reducing the heating of cities, and having that shade is really important. So plant trees, plant native trees, because they do particularly well here. They're not going to be a pest, and they have fabulous biodiversity benefits. Extreme rainfall and flooding. As we build cities, we harden surfaces. As we're just having today, you can see water is pulled out on the roads around us and on the pavement. But where there's lawn, it's just gone straight into the ground. So one of the things that people are doing now is they're starting to put in green swales and take out hard surfaces and have those drainage lines, etc., and have the plants soak up the water and deal with it. So when we have gardens and trees with streets with trees, it reduces runoff, and that's really important for flooding. And another thing is, of course, is coastal erosion and flooding. And planting natives protects our dunes, mangroves protects our area from extreme wave events. So we know that where mangroves are, they're protected from the tsunami that happened a few years ago. And our wetlands are really important for that too. So native plants help. Your question is, okay, so I want to grow natives, I'm going to reduce climate change. This is good. Well, how do I choose the right plant? We have this free app, Grow Native. Please download it. It works really well. Unfortunately, at this very moment, but in a week it will be fixed, it's not downloading from Android, but it is from Apple Store. It will be back on Android within a week. And if you do that, you can restore biodiversity. You can put in your suburb and it will tell you what are the natives to your suburb. You can choose it by garden style. You might want to have a rainforest if you're in a shady area. You might want a wetland. You might like Hamptons. I don't mind. But use natives. They will give you the same result. They will use less water when you have that garden style. You can choose by plant characteristics. You can have, how can I know which is a water-wise plant to use? Choose it by that. How can I know which is the best plants to attract butterflies and bees and produce habitat for the plants? Select by those characteristics. It will tell you. For each plant, like this beautiful Phaeus, an endangered orchid as I mentioned, it has photos, it has a description, it has the names, it has the range, it has the best conditions to grow it in, it has what garden styles that it suits. It also tells you about its conservation status. This one is an endangered species. It tells you when it flowers and it tells you when you can source the plant. So grow natives, really good idea, really important thing we can do with climate change. So greening our campuses and our cities makes them more resilient to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Do we have any questions at this stage for Catherine? Chris has the microphone box. No, we're all... Oh, I've got a question over there, Chris.
Chris? Oh, there's one over here. In the red.
I don't want to throw it too far. It's like a microphone or something. Oh, interesting.
I know one of the issues with planting native can be actually sourcing the native plants. Do you have any recommendations of where you would be able to get them?
Well, at this very moment, just over there, we're giving away free native plants, as we have here. So very easy to source it. You've got your plant. On the stock list here, we actually list which organisations have native plants. But one of the things I would recommend to you, a large hardware store, which will remain nameless but begins with a B, actually accounts for 40% of all of the plants sold in Australia for horticulture. So when you go in there, ask them what native plants they have. If it's not stocking the native plants on the app, ask them, because knowing that creates demand means they will supply them. But that's why we put the stock list there of a whole lot of organisations, commercial nurseries, etc., that specialise in natives. So you can go and access them there. Thank you.
This is cool. Do I volleyball it across? No, better not. Okay, so Gold Coast is my home. I love my home. The parts I love about it include the green bits and the sandy bits, and you know, we've sort of come from the swamp and we have to live somewhere, and I accept that. And so that's a bit of a story to arrive at my question. In terms of green cities are supportive of our ability to
Adapt to climate change.
In climate change, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the context. But just generally, is that in the agenda, would you say, when we're developing the Gold Coast space at the moment?
It's increasingly both collectively for the Gold Coast City Council, for the university and other places, and individuals are starting to realise this importance. And there are a whole lot of initiatives about that around the swales and things like that, for example. So if you go down to the Broadlands Parkwater, never get it right, down there, you'll see they've actually planted out with natives, but they've put in these wetlands specifically to deal with stormwater drainage. The Commonwealth Games Village has the same thing. So they've had to deal with how to deal with stormwater, and they've put in they've created wetlands using natives to deal with it. So increasingly developments are required to do that. What we're trying to do is help people have that information so it makes it easier to make the decisions.
Sounds
Thank you very
fabulous.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was fantastic. Our final speaker today is Dr. Leah Barclay. Leah is a research fellow at the Queensland Conservatorium Research Centre. She specialises in electroacoustic music, acoustic ecology, and emerging fields of biology, exploring environmental patterns and changes through sound. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. You might be wondering, what on earth is a composer from the Conservatorium doing at a sustainability fair talking about climate change? And I'm here because I truly believe that sound is one of the most powerful tools for us to understand and respond to climate change. And I'm passionate about the role of sound in two ways. We have this really exciting emerging field of ecoacoustics, which allows us to really map environmental patterns and changes through sound. It's non-invasive, it's accessible, the technology is becoming increasingly affordable, so it's this kind of groundbreaking revolutionary technique that allows us to put these devices in the hands of communities. And in parallel to that scientific opportunity, I'm equally passionate about the role of sound in public engagement, because sound allows us to have this embodied connection with the environment. So as a sound artist, I create these installations and performances that allow us to connect to these changing ecosystems in different ways. As we've heard from some of the presenters, that public engagement around this scientific evidence that we all know so well is still a big challenge. So I find art, creativity, sound really powerful to do that. So both of those perspectives, from both this artistic and scientific perspective, involve recording the environment. So I've been really privileged to travel to different parts of the world and record these changing ecosystems. And I think something that struck me very early in my career when doing this work is this idea that as humans, we really only have access to a tiny amount of sound that exists in the world. So many different species are communicating in a completely different frequency band that we obviously can't hear as humans. And just this idea that there's all of this sound in our environment that we can use to understand climate change that we don't have access to. So I've been really passionate about just how we can use this idea of listening and sound to understand changing environments. And before I dive into a couple of projects, I just want to give you a very brief example. This isn't one of my recordings. This is one of the pioneers of the field of soundscape ecology, Bernie Krause, who's based in California. And this is 4 of his recordings over the course of 10 years. So he basically calls this example Climate Change in 60 Seconds. Fingers crossed we are going to have sound. We do have sound. So if you can't see in the corner, that's 2004 we're hearing a recording from now. (2009). (2014). And that final one is just a couple of years ago in 2015. So it's quite a simple example, and I'm sure it's quite obvious what's happening in that recording. But what I love about this example is how it does give you an embodied connection with what's happening in that ecosystem. And what I also find very powerful about this example is I can show this to children, to 5-year-old children in a class, and they'll tell me exactly what's happening. They'll say, well, the drought means that the birds can't live in that environment anymore, so they're dying or they're leaving. And if I showed them a graph of what was happening in that ecosystem, and I have, I'm sure and I know they don't have the same response. So I find sound such a powerful tool to be able to really connect people with these ecosystems. So at Griffith, I'm currently leading 3 projects which are all designed in quite a similar way. River listening is mapping the cultural and biological diversity of global river systems. So we're recording the sounds beneath the surface to understand what lives or what doesn't live in those river systems and mapping those environments through sound. Biosphere Soundscapes is a collaboration with UNESCO, working with UNESCO biosphere reserves, again mapping the cultural and biological diversity of changing biosphere reserves through sound. So we work directly with local communities and bring artists and scientists into those environments to install these recording and live streaming devices. And then the final research project that I'm currently leading is called Sonic Reef, which is basically using sound as both a monitoring tool and a tool for activism to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And through all of these projects, I'm using a particular device that's up on the screen right now called a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone. And this particular style of microphone was really my gateway into science. It was these devices that made me really passionate about the information that was in sound, because I was putting these hydrophones in different river systems. This is the Mary River in Queensland, and hearing these amazing soundscapes and not really knowing what the sounds were I could hear, but then putting it in a different river system such as Narmada River in North India, very polluted, and hearing a completely and utterly different soundscape. So realizing that all of these different river systems had quite a distinctive voice and were full of information. And I started to dive a little bit deeper into the science to understand what this meant. Obviously, when we think about, aquatic soundscapes, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the sound of whales and dolphins, very familiar sounds, but maybe not so much freshwater fish or insects. So I started to research a little bit and discovered that there were really only a handful of scientists in the world that were working on freshwater ecoacoustics, and one of them happened to be right here at Griffith University, Dr. Simon Linke, who's been a long-term collaborator of mine. And if we looked at, the surface of a river or a lake, we literally have no idea what's happening beneath the surface. So, climate change is often very visible in an environment like this. We can see the trees, we can hear the birds, but climate change is often, going by unnoticed in many aquatic ecosystems. And I started to dive deeper into some of these techniques, and the scientists that I've been working with as well agree that many of the techniques that are still traditionally used are very invasive. Capture and release, electrofishing, classic methods do not reflect reality, in the words of Simon Linke. But this idea of using hydrophones, underwater microphones, is very, very possible in these environments. So just to give you a quick example, some of the species that we're trying to monitor, a black drumfish makes a sound like this. A spangled perch in a river in North Queensland sounds like this. This is a catfish in the Brisbane River. And all these different aquatic insects make a whole range of very identifiable sounds. I'll stop that example there. So we can basically put these very accessible and affordable hydrophones into the water and be either live streaming or recording these in real time straight back to a database and understand what is living in these river systems. And what's also very exciting is we can actually hand make these devices now. And so in parallel to all of this research, I've been equally passionate about putting these devices in the hands of communities, particularly young people in communities, and allowing them to actually hand make these devices. These are some 10-year-old girls in the Noosa Biosphere Reserve making their own hydrophones and mapping the changing soundscapes of the Noosa River. And, as the generation that's going to experience the true ramifications of climate change, I really believe that if we can inspire young people to engage with these ecosystems and understand them in new ways where they're passionate about protecting what lives beneath the surface, I really think there's hope for the future. And what I also love about working with young people is, you know, all of these children just think it's completely normal to get a hydrophone and put it in the river and start recording the sounds of fish, to the point that some of them were even asking for hydrophones for Christmas, which I found a particularly good outcome from the workshop. So just to finish, in parallel with the artistic work, we're also taking all of these sounds back to the communities and making them incredibly accessible. They're not just living on a scientific database. We're using mobile applications to basically create different ways for people to interact with these recordings. So we create these river listening sound walks and listening underwater sound walks, where you can walk along a river system and listen to all those recordings and also listen to live streams. So that allows you to, again, connect with those sounds beneath the surface in a completely different way. And these change with real-time data in response to the river system. We've just finished a new version of this on the Sunshine Coast for Horizon Festival, just last night actually, where it connected the coastline as well. So these pieces basically responded to the tide. So you could walk along Mooloolaba Beach and listen to passing humpback whales, and those soundscapes change throughout the day with the tides. So you could put your feet in the water and connect with these aquatic ecosystems in a completely different way. And I might finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Great, so we now have a little bit of time left to us for Q&A. The panel are available to answer questions specifically to them, or if you've got any burning questions that you would like to ask of all the members of our panel, that's fine as well.
It's me again. Is there much of a body of research about sound and health, natural sounds and health, this kind of thing?
Yes, there is. The field of acoustic ecology, which has been pretty active humanities field since the kind of late 70s, has done a lot of research around initially the impact of noise on our health. So it was quite a strong activism movement to advocate against noise in urban environments, how that was having quite a negative effect on perception and cognition. And more recently, there's been a lot of research around the value of natural sound as a tool for public health. And we've been exploring that from a distance with some of these augmented reality applications to see how people change, the way they walk in the environment when they're listening to these natural soundscapes as opposed to, the sound of traffic on the road. So I think there's some really exciting research possibilities there as well.
Just for interest's sake, to add to that, I'm just back from a conference in France which was looking at national parks, and they had some research where they were looking at the issue about helicopter flights going up to glacier walks in New Zealand, and they were looking at the impact that soundscape, or that change in the soundscape, was having on people's experience, and talking about how in national parks, not only the landscape but the soundscape is something that needs to be conserved, and people's valuing of that sound experience in nature, to not be hearing noise, artificial sounds of machines, and how they need to start regulating for the soundscapes in national parks because of this issue about how the sound of nature makes people feel, and then an expectation that that's a right, not only visually but auditorily, to have that natural experience.
My question is for CP. You talked about using natives to ameliorate climate change, so that's increasing plants that already should be here. Is there a movement to remove the introduced species, or is it important to address that as well?
There is, and my own, certainly there are major weeds, and they're increasing recognition that when we I showed my daughter a book of weed plants from the region, and she said, but they're all pretty. And I went, well, that's because a lot of them jumped the backyard and came out of the gardens and then turned feral and took over a lot of the wetlands and killing the trees. So there are programs, and the Gold Coast City Council and the Queensland Government do ones where they make suggestions about substituting in. And this is what we're about, is substituting. And it's also this issue that we're not saying you have to have a particular aesthetic. You can have any aesthetic, and we can do it in natives. But certainly you get more biodiversity benefits, including the issue to do with water that Wade has mentioned. So as we get these long dry periods, we want plants that are not going to need supplementary watering, and certainly not using tap water. And so that's one of the reasons that we're trying to get people. But certainly it's a substitution process rather than a clear and replace.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yuri?
My question's for Wade. It's a sort of half-formed question, but I know water is of geostrategic importance, and so at the nation-state level, there's a sort of possibly a realpolitik approach where we're not very idealistic. We'll just do what's necessary in the national interest, and as part of that is the sort of ideology of the invisible hand of the market, sorting out resource allocation without the need for public policy to intervene. As scientists, it's always the difficulty of always competing against that narrative. So, what's your experience of that? Trying to speak to the ideology of the market forces, as it were.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think our experience in the Murray-Darling Basin is one that we often reflect on because it cuts across Canberra as well as 4 other states. It's one that's a contested water source. So it's one of those trans-boundary water systems. So there's been great debates in Europe with rivers that run through multiple countries, but we've kind of got the same thing here with the Murray-Darling Basin. And the challenge has always been trying to get the balance between what the river system needs so that it can survive and function properly, and what the wetlands need, and all of the migratory birds that rely on those wetlands, and marrying that up against our agricultural needs. So the Murray-Darling is the food bowl of Australia. So how we get that balance right is really critical, and a lot of that environmental water that I spoke of, that 1,200 billion litres that are allocated for the environment, that buyback of water was in recognition of the fact that we had over-allocated. So we'd been giving more water to irrigators than the river could give. So it's been trying to address that imbalance has been really interesting. From the scale of farmers burning the Murray-Darling Basin Plan to people thinking we've brought back too much water, and now obviously the heat's on in terms of this drought. So I think that dialogue needs to continue, and it's really important to ensure that culturally we've got the right balance, socially, economically, and for the environment. So it's across all of those pillars that we need to have a very open conversation about it.
Thanks.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? No? I've got a question. I guess you're all here at Griffith, you're all doing research, but you all seem very engaged in kind of communicating about the work that you do outside of the university. And I just wondered if you had any comments or thoughts, I suppose, about your roles as kind of public intellectuals and engaging outside the university to communicate about what it is that you're doing.
I think we all recognise as academics, and particularly academics publicly funded in a publicly funded university, that we have an obligation and a role to the community to engage and exchange and share our knowledge, and to do this transition from our individual research projects through training PhD students and undergraduate students, but also engaging with the community in so many ways. And this is part of the very essence of Griffith, is this idea of society benefit out of the institution. And so in climate change being the biggest challenge that's going to face all of our lives, it's really important when we do this research to take opportunities such as this and others to engage and reflect, like the acoustic sound work is a way of making people understand and see that. but for all of us to have that engagement, and not only what the problem is, but I think the other part is this really strong emphasis on solutions and on ways that we can do it. I'm always conscious that people can end up quite depressed when we talk about climate change, and that's not to deny the seriousness and importance, but we also need to have things that we can do individually to make a difference, because it's out of that feelings, and this is part of the soundscape, it's the way we feel that is so important in making these decisions. So we need to give people solutions, and we need to give them ways to have hope and to look forward to the future.
Basically, yes, we have an obligation now as a scientist to translate a complex idea so that decision maker and ordinary people can understand. So for that, I actually venture into making films. And we have a film called Dealing with Disaster, and it has been wonderful in linking public health disaster and climate change adaptation. And now I get requests from everywhere, from the world, to show in their conferences. And I think showing real people and real crisis and communicate that passion, that real situation, much better than 100 academic papers. And so, because they are all sort of boring and dry, and you're talking to the converted and you're talking to each other. And it's time that we just don't talk to each other. Oh, we talk to each other. Still important for your promotion and all this, but I think our duty is to the whole society.
Yep. Just in the field of marketing and technology and, you know, all the cool stuff to do with apps and whatnot, a huge growing area is user experience, okay? And I just want to know if you guys have ever, from your end, if you guys are exposed to any collaborations with product designers or anything like that, because part of this issue that I'm also hearing is people, just the general public, consumers in general, they want easy solutions as well to things like recycling and whatnot. And I think that the kind of, you know, the what's the word I'm looking for? The advancements in that area of user experience, I've heard could possibly be part of the solution. Are you guys exposed to anything of that in your research or anything?
But Griffith University is about to introduce a double degree in, well, lots of double degrees in business, marketing, tourism, etc., and data science, and environment and data science. And when you talk about user-created content, we're really conscious of that. And at the moment, we have a whole lot of research looking at environmental issues and how people engage with them using social media. So, for example, we have a project for a student who's just over there handing out plants today, and she's looking at what people tweet about Gold Coast and nature. And we've got another one which is just done looking at the spit, where we're engaged with communicating, asking how people, when they're having their conversations, if we can listen in and find out how they value nature, they value the environment, how they interact with it, and also how can we more effectively communicate with them. And that relates to the soundscape research and others. So yeah, it's really important to get with the technology, and I have to say we believe so much that there's increasing the use of data and information and ways to communicate it. And so, for example, there's lots of really powerful visualizations, for example, the amount of energy used and the amount of water reduced that have been done using these live streaming of big data sets. So yes, definitely, let's go there.
Yeah, cool.
Me learn there's a whole new world, and I start to understand how important sound engineers are. But we did a poster, and I think that drew more attention than many speeches and other. And I think the imagination and technology and art, all this combined to capture people's imagination and passion is going to be very important. So go back to my point about partnership. I do learn a lot from the partners.
I was going to say as well, with developing some of the sound apps and recording apps and things like that, I mean, they've been done in collaboration with conservation organisations for conservation purposes, and it's always been fascinating to see what sort of ideas arise and how things evolve when you put, you know, a scientist, the CEO of a conservation organisation, an app developer, a programmer and a graphic designer in a room, and you know, there's going to be a solution there. And I think that comes back to a lot of those messages there is, you know, when we're talking about climate change adaptation, this idea of interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary thinking and embedding these projects in communities but making them as accessible and as engaging as possible is critical. And I mean, with, you know, the initial versions of some of these apps, I mean, the sounds didn't load for 3 seconds, for example. You know, you stood on site and I thought, well, that's fine. You know, people can wait 3 seconds for a sound to load. That's perfectly normal. And they didn't. No one did. Everyone would just keep clicking it because it wouldn't load in 3 seconds. So I think to work with, you know, intensely with programmers and with interface designers to make these experiences as accessible as possible, especially if there's a lot of research money being invested in it, is absolutely critical, yeah.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, that might be a great place for us to wrap up. We've got some small gifts to thank our presenters, but if you don't mind to put your hands together to thank them all for their contribution today. If anyone's at the Nathan campus, there is a second Lightning Talks session as part of Sustainability Week this Thursday. You can access information about that on the Sustainability Week section on the Griffith website.